Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom Podcast, episode number 80, and we are digging into sort of an open question about Frank Herbert's Dune saga, the last two books of his Dune saga in particular, Heretics of Dune, Chapterhouse Dune. People don't seem to like them, or they think they're boring. There's a lot of content out there, and people they either kind of go through the first trilogy or they like the first book, and then they kind of make it through the second books. But people even think, Dune Messiah is not a good book, which is always shocking to me. So, I want to kind of go into a little bit about the Dune saga. When I say Dune saga, I'm talking about the canon of only the Frank Herbert books. But I do want to think about some kind of open questions around the Brian Herbert works and Kevin J. Anderson works, because obviously there's a big fan base for these books too. And they do take a pretty good attempt, I would say, at least, if you don't think of it as a cash grab, just in the idea of, hey, how do we expand on this universe? Because it is a cool universe and it is tempting to expand on it. Whether they did a good job or not is another question. But I think if we start out with the idea of, the saga, and then these two books place in the saga, and then I want to kind of stress some of the importance of that. I'll dive a little bit into our alchemy and anthroposophy in the Dune saga, where we kind of talk about some alchemical and anthroposophical themes. So first off, it's not an action adventure, these two books, although there is lots of action, lots of adventure. I read these books when I was in high school, probably when they first came out, and I thought they were the greatest books. I thought they were so cool. But I think it's part of the world building, and it's for a certain kind of fan. So if you go out and you look at Quinn or some of the hardcore Dune fans out there, those fans love God Emperor of Dune, right? There's a lot of fandom that loves God Emperor of Dune. We've even talked about it as the ethics of Frank Herbert in a weird way on this channel and some other podcasts. But let me break out. Let's break out the saga itself. So we start out with the original Frank Herbert saga. We get Dune, Messiah, and Children of Dune, right? This is sort of that original classic trilogy, right? Most of what we've seen in the movie is from the first book. There was a mini-series that worked some of the content of the second books in there. But we really see the rise and then incompleteness of Muad'Dib, and then we see the rise of Leto II, who's his son. And then this is the entry to that saga. Now, I think traditionally there's been kind of a camp to call this the second trilogy, but I have a different kind of architecture for the second three books, because I see this as sort of a linchpin book, and I see it sort of like this book sits between these books and sort of this book, right? I kind of see it as this. And I think that the missing Frank Herbert seventh book, or the missing Frank Herbert seventh book, would sit here. And we took a pass at this. I took a pass at this as a young writer trying to write this up. Just the original Dune Revenant was sort of architecting in that way. And the way I sort of saw the seventh book would be continuing the themes from Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune, but resonating back to God Emperor Dune, because this is what sets things in motion. So why is this sort of interesting? So let's look at let's call it the timelines of these books, right? And I think the timelines of it really help to frame why Heretics and Chapterhouse are really interesting, I guess, to me at least, and to a lot of Dune fans. And maybe some of this interest will rub off on people. Then I think we'll go into some of the philosophical themes that these books discuss. So I think starting off with, let's talk about 4 timelines of Dune. All right. So we have this new HBO series, Dune Prophecy. It takes place in the Denis Villeneuve sort of universe. It takes place 10,000 years before Dune. And I think this is kind of like the timeline 1. Let's call pre-Dune the timeline 1. Right? Everything between Dune in this column. And I think Brian Herbert has done a lot of work with his Butlerian Jihad books and all of those books. I've read a bunch of them. I'm not a huge fan, and not so much for the. I mean, I don't like the plot points, and I don't like some of the details that you can watch other people talk about those. But mostly, I don't like the tone of it. I don't like the tone and the philosophical core, because I think at the core of it, Frank Herbert is really being somewhat of a mouthpiece for some Jungian ideas and some very philosophical ideas, especially ideas of Samuel Butler, which we can talk about with the Butlerian Jihad. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I think that tone was missing. But let's just kind of sum it up as this. 10,000 years before the events of Dune, the Bene Gesserit were pursuing this breeding program to produce this super being called the Kwisatz Haderach, can transcend time and space. They've already mastered somewhat their own ability to control their bodies. They've mastered some other memory techniques where they can remember their ancestors' memories, which is really important. And they have somewhat ability to have things like truth sense and even some prophecy, as this new saga will explore. So the new saga kind of takes place in how this all gets set up, right? Now, what happens in Dune is Paul Atreides becomes, this is sort of like the timeline 2, sort of like. This is where the rise of Paul Atreides is sort of the end of this first timeline. So all that 10,000 years culminates in Dune, and then the events of Dune Messiah, and then finally the birth of Leto II. And I think this is with Leto II we kind of go into our second timeline, because all these books take place within the life of 2 generations, let's say. But now if we move these out and we focus on God Emperor, this God Emperor is now, we find ourselves well along Leto II, the God Emperor's 3,500-year reign as the God Emperor of Dune. So he's been in control of the universe for 3,500 years in this human worm hybrid that's slowly turning him into a worm, 100%. And he's done this to sort of, there's a lot of themes in here about his golden path. He's outwitting the Bene Gesserit. He's put a chokehold on all of spice production. He controls technology, and he's really steering the course of humanity, let's say. He's also only given the Bene Gesserit the minimal amount of spice to keep their order moving all this time. So the Bene Gesserit becomes like a reluctant participant in Leto's plans over this era, and this culminates in the end of the tyrant's reign. We'll call it like that way, just so you can find out for yourself. What we find afterwards, though, is these last 2 books. So this is the aftermath of the tyrant. So now we're another 1,500 years in the future after the time of Dune. So now we're a full 5,000 years in the future after the events of Muad'Dib. So think of our own history. 5,000 years ago, we're talking about the Egyptians, the Sumerians. We barely know about what's going on there. So one thing that's amazing with how Herbert works this, even in the God Emperor of Dune, so imagine 3,500 years after Dune, it's almost like a mythological event. The Muad'Dib event is almost mythological. And you can even see in the beginning of this book, there's like a Hadi Benito announcing the discoveries of the Dar es Balat on the planet of Arrakis. This is the discovery of the journals, the Rydulian crystal paper, with all of the notes. It's sort of like the hard drives of Leto II. We discover all of his data stores, all of his journals, all of his writing. And I think this might even take place in this timeline. All right, so now we're full 5,000 years after the events of Dune. This is the aftermath of the tyrant. So after the death of Leto, the Bene Gesserit found themselves sort of outmaneuvered, stripped of all their dominance, and so they started to rethink what was their function. Right, so before the Kwisatz Haderach, they thought their function, and this is kind of explored in the new series, right? What are the Bene Gesserit doing that's going to lead up to the eventual creation of Paul? Why did they want to have a leader? Well, they wanted to have their own leader in place because of many themes of maybe the weakness of humanity, and they thought that they could find a way to create a balanced leader, and a leader that they would have somewhat influence over, as opposed to, what we see by the time of the Dune saga is a quite divisive universe of feudal houses, Atreides versus Harkonnens, and the puppeting by the imperial seat. And you think of in the idea of being across many planets, we can see that, even if you look at a series like The Expanse or something like this, right? Just a couple planets, and there's so many diverse cultures can start emerging. How would this be governed, and how would it be thought through? And I think the Bene Gesserit sort of see themselves as somewhat as a part of, the overlap with Herbert's influence from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. Like, this is some kind of ordering to assist humankind. And it kind of backfires on them, because Paul then takes it to another place, and then Leto takes it to the ultimate place. And what I call this, and we have a podcast on this too, I call this the ethics of God, the ethics of Frank Herbert, because I think in God Emperor, the theme is sort of along the lines that he becomes the evilest, most domineering leader in order for humanity to find ways to evolve past him. Right? So it's a bit like a Brothers Karamazov story, right? Brothers Karamazov, and again, you see, like, this is not page turner stuff about, well, then the Atreides went to the supermarket, and then they met the Harkonnens in the 7-Eleven, and then they had a crysknife fight, and the evil Atreides fought the good Harkonnen guy, and it's not that kind of an action thing, right? It's more like the action of these later books is on the scale of humanity's potential future, given things like computers, genetic manipulation, these kind of things. What does it mean to be human? And what is the philosophy that will keep humans moving forward? And what the God Emperor kind of thinks of, and this is why I say it's sort of like the dense kind of reading of Brothers Karamazov, is that Karamazov has 3 different children, and they sort of are quite different from each other. The children of humanity in the Dune saga are things like the Bene Tleilax, the Bene Gesserit, the great houses, and then maybe like the Ixians or something like this, where there's technocrats, there's bioengineers, there's these transhuman humanists. I'll call those the Bene Gesserit, and then you've got the feudal tendencies, right? So this, in this aftermath sort of phase, the Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune, they're showcasing this adaptation by the Bene Gesserit. They've begun to adopt the Tleilaxu ghola program, right? They're starting to look at synthetic spice production. They're starting to see how does a ghola program work with their idea of a new kind of missionaria protectiva. They also have this other threat, which is after the fall of the God Emperor, humanity fled the Imperium for the far reaches of space. And that was called the Scattering. And there's a rogue Bene Gesserit group known as the Honored Matres. And they're coming back, or matres, Honored Matres or matres. So the Honored Mothers kind of thing. But they're a kind of dark version of the Bene Gesserit. And they're returning from this scattering. And so this is like that. This is sort of where we find ourselves with Heretics of Dune. Opening up in Heretics of Dune, we have an amazing bit here where they actually have a Duncan Idaho ghola. So the Bene Gesserit, are working to awaken the memories of the Duncan Idaho ghola. And they're on their 12th Duncan Idaho ghola. So they said, Taraza told you, did she not, that we have gone through 11 of these Duncan Idaho gholas. This one is the 12th. The old Reverend Mother Shuang Yu spoke with delicate bitterness. Gone through, the Reverend Mother Lucilla thought. She allowed herself a short nod. We have used up our supply. Send us more. Right? So this concept here is no longer are the gholas a thing of only the Bene Tleilax. So why the interest in the ghola of Duncan Idaho? Well, as we know, as far back as Dune, let's start all the way back to Dune. Duncan Idaho, beloved friend, trainer, teacher, loyal Atreides loyalist, beloved friend of Paul Atreides, and then martyred, dies in the war against the Harkonnens. He kind of is a symbol of the ultimate trust, it's almost like friend incarnate, your friend who fights for you, your friend who fights to the death for you, sort of philosophically. It's an archetype of this. By Dune Messiah, he comes back in the form, the first time, as a Bene Tlalac's ghola. What's a ghola? A ghola is kind of like a clone. So they've cloned Duncan Idaho, and the Bene Tlalac's have presented Muad'Dib with this clone in order to have control over him, use him as an assassin. Muad'Dib's across all these possibilities, right? He doesn't trust the gift, and yet he accepts the gift because he thinks that there's part of it, it's interwoven with his prophecy. And he ends up having a role with Elia, the sister of Paul in Children of Dune. And one thing that's fascinating in the Dune Messiah timeline is, or in the Dune first trilogy timeline, is Duncan Idaho is able to restore his original memories. So it's not a clone in the sense of, you imagine we have a clone. Our traditional thought is you clone something, but the memories won't come through. But Herbert purports the idea that the clone, actually, the ghola, you can awaken the ghola's memory, and it's usually through some kind of traumatic thing. So there's some traumatic events, and then suddenly the ghola, Duncan Idaho, remembers being the original Duncan Idaho. He remembers his death. Well, this becomes fascinating for the God Emperor of Dune, because remembering this, he starts to get a constant supply of Duncan Idaho gholas. And over the years, there's thousands and thousands. I can remember having the old Dune encyclopedia, and they would list out all of the different Duncans. So through Leto II's 3,500-year reign, he has reincarnated Duncan Idaho's and actually used him to sort of retain some of the old Atreides bloodline, like a control group almost. And it's almost like the God Emperor has taken on the Bene Gesserit breeding program, but using it with an Atreides refining process to create a kind of person that's resistant to prophecy. So this is some of the features that happen. So now we're talking about some of the core concepts of these later books. Gholas that can resist prophecy, returned dark honored matres, the role of Duncan Idaho as a quasi Kwisatz Haderach. So what happens in Heretics of Dune? We have this sort of theme of the awakening of the Duncan Idaho Ghola's memories in Heretics. So we have a general named Miles Tegg. He's a beloved Atreides bloodline related ally of the Bene Gesserit. And he is the mentor, trainer, mentat general who trains Duncan Idaho. And they've even found that in this 5,000 years of evolution, the Duncan Idaho is a bit slower than people of the time. There's something like, imagine we look at old sports footage before and then modern sports footage, how, the time to run a mile is crushed over time. Like humans find ways to push themselves into new areas. And I think that very much so, a lot of the Bene Gesserit kind of message is, how do we push the human into a more powerful version of that? We have the mentats also. So in the world where we've banned thinking machines, we have humans who can think like computers, right? So we hone the skill of the human mind way beyond our minds. And we can have mentats who can do amazing calculations just using their brain. And we have guild navigators who can fold space with just their mind, something like this. So all of these are showing like Herbert's concept of of a sort of a humanism that evolves the human into higher states. And I think a lot of those themes get explored in these books. So Miles Tegg is training Duncan Idaho, and eventually in Heretics of Dune, Tegg awakens Duncan Idaho's memories. And Duncan Idaho remembers who he was. But now, if we think about it, the Bene Gesserit have been taking cells of the original Duncan Idaho, and I think back in Dune Messiah they describe it as they went to the battle site where Duncan Idaho was killed after the Arrakis War that we saw in Dune. I think that they said that they spent, trillions of dollars and resources to comb through all the rubble and sample every bit of, like every little speck of hair or skin fleck across all of the rubble in search for Duncan Idaho's cells. And they finally sifted through it and they found those. So it's sort of like, imagine after atomics go off, they find some morsel of Duncan Idaho that they can grow the ghola from. So this is how intensely the Bene Gesserit were focused on this. It's something like this. You guys can correct me in the comments. This is how I remember it. So they had these ghola cells, but then during the 3,500 years of the tyrant's rule, they were keeping probably the most immaculate database of versions of Duncan Idaho, different kind of experiments they've tried. I think that they even mentioned God Emperor of Dune. One time they brought him back as a woman. Other times they brought him back, I think in the original one they brought him back as a blind. They brought him back as a mentat. So they've trained them in different skills along the years. And it's all kind of a thing. In a weird way, it kind of has a feeling of a jester, but a not funny jester. Right? You know how like there's always a companion? Because once the ghola sort of, what the Emperor realizes is the trait of Duncan Idaho to be just and loyal to the idea of goodness and Atreides values, of which the God Emperor actively acted against to suppress humanity in order to strengthen it to overcome him. The Duncans would, almost in all cases, the Duncans would try to kill or assassinate the God Emperor or do something, and he would end up he could see it coming a mile away, plus he can see the future, so it's a very hard villain to defeat. But in the meantime, the Bene Gesserit and the God Emperor sort of had this experiment going with the Duncan. Now, by the time we get to Duncan Idaho in Chapterhouse Dune, something amazing happens. So in Chapterhouse Dune, Duncan Idaho, I think under the influence of the Honored Matres, they're trying to use their ability to use their femininity. I think that they can do things where they can basically bond a person to them. So it's sort of like they can turn men into slaves, something like this. It's sort of like a power that it's sort of a twisted version of a Bene Gesserit power. It's like some kind of dominance kind of thing. And Duncan Idaho resists it, but what it ends up doing is it triggers not only the original memories, but all of his memories from all of his deaths across the entire 3,500 years of the God Emperor timeline, the original Dune timeline, as well as up to date with his current timeline. So suddenly Duncan Idaho is like superpositioned as the only other person besides Paul Muad'Dib and Leto, and I guess Bene Gesserit mothers, who's got a kind of other memory. Except in the traditional Bene Gesserit other memory, they have memories of all their female ancestors through time. Right? So in the Dune saga, we've got a podcast on this as well. In the Dune saga, the Bene Gesserits have the ability to awaken their ancestral memories, and they can remember all of the generations of their mother's matrilineal line. But with Paul Atreides, and then later with Elia and with Leto II, they can also remember all of their ancestors. So there's often throughout God Emperor Dune where the God Emperor remembers, different times in Earth's history from the point of view of his ancestors. So all of these memories come flooding back. And with Elia, this ends up getting her possessed by the memory imago of the Baron Harkonnen. He comes up as because Elia never had a core personality. She was born with other memories. As we'll see them probably explore that in the Dune 3 movie. But so with Chapterhouse Dune, now we've got this other kind of Kwisatz Haderach-like character, but he doesn't have ancestral memories. He has multiple death memories, which I think is a very reincarnation and anthroposophical kind of idea. So I guess, so here we are. We've gone deep into these books. We can talk a little bit more about some of the themes from the books. For example, I feel Heretics of Dune, we have lots of themes. We've got the scattering post Leto II. So after this millennial rule, the tyrant has people on a golden path, and now we see the aftermath of this. We see the rise of the Honored Matres. We see the Bene Gesserit rebuilding power. We also see this ability of there's a girl that emerges on Arrakis, which was formerly called Arrakis. So now Dune, it's so old now that Dune is no longer called Arrakis, it's just called Arrakis. And some of that Leto II genetic legacy is now manifesting through this character, Shiana. She can actually control the sandworms with her thoughts, right? And then there's also this kind of, she's sort of seen as a prophet, and there's like a Fremen-like reverence for her, like she's a messenger from God. We've got the Duncan Idaho clones. So the Bene Gesserit have blended a bit with the Bene Gesserit technology. We see Duncan's memories get restored. And we can see the sort of the fight against the Honored Matres is starting to ramp up. So by the time we get to Chapterhouse Dune, when we get to Chapterhouse, we start to flip to another level where now the war is going full on between the Bene Gesserit and the Bene Gesserit. And we see this memory awakening of Duncan. So he has the multiple memory awakening. So this is like a continuation of the ghola program, but almost executed by the Bene Gesserit at this time. We also see the idea of sort of what is the final outcome of the God Emperor's planning. Is it a Kwisatz Haderach? Is it a quasi Kwisatz Haderach? How is this going to work with the new Dune universe, with the return of the schools? And I think we're left with Chapterhouse with kind of a cliffhanger, and it's sort of a cliffhanger that we explore here. There's a merging. They decide that they have to merge the Bene Gesserit and the Honored Matres. They've got to bring these two schools back together, integration. So you see a kind of an integrative theme, which is also an alchemical theme, right? You take the opposites and you merge them back together, and now you're stronger. Just like the Bene Gesserit adopted the Bene Gesserit ideas, now we're using synthetic spice. We learned that the Bene Gesserit had their own Kwisatz Haderach program. And we start to see these archetypal things of cycles of rebirth, the eternal return, a collective unconscious. All of this access of other memories is kind of a collective unconscious. And Duncan Idaho is sort of, again, the architect to merge these realities. But let's kind of take it one level deeper. I want to talk a little bit about two themes now. I guess in this part of the podcast, I want to talk a little bit about, let's put ourselves in the timeline of Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune. What are the schools thinking of, right? And I think of it in the terms of like our alchemy and anthroposophy in the Dune saga. We've got a section here that's about the it's about Heretics and Chapterhouse in the terms of what are the underlying philosophies of these schools at this period, right? So the idea is, what is the Bene Gesserit underlying theory? So I have this towards the theories of Talaxu, originary Evo theory, and Bene Gesserit mythogeneticism as evidenced from Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune. So the idea now is we're going to take a turn into sort of the philosophical side of this, right? So first off, let's talk a bit about what we mean here. So the idea is, let's look at it from the point of view of what would the Bene Gesserit, what would be their motivation at this time in the timeline? So the Kwisatz Haderach program basically failed. They ended up creating a superhuman that took over the universe, right? So, and then at the same time, they're using the Tleilaxu science They're using Tleilaxu science. So let's talk about Tleilaxu originary theory. So the idea is the Tleilaxu genetic mystery. It's not just mechanical manipulation, but they almost have a metaphysical thought of unlocking the latent potential inside human biological systems, right? So they sort of like they're open to experimentation, genetic manipulation, all along the idea of how do we unlock something within the human. And I think the Bene Gesserit sort of traditionally are more attuned to a kind of collective unconscious Jungian thought where they think of it more as how do we bring together the mating pairs to produce characteristics just like they would do, like you would do in a dog breeding program or something like this. Like how do we steer humanity through selective breeding programs? Now these are two very different schools, but by the time we get to the Heretics and Chapterhouse Dune timeline, all of that has been that whole apple cart has been turned over by the God Emperor. So I thought that let's think of it as two different kind of ways of thinking. Let's think of it as the Bene Tleilax are almost the Bene Tleilax are a bit more of an evolutionary Darwinian kind of school, and the Bene Gesserit, they're more of a psychological school in the sense of they're looking for traits in the natural order. Where the Bene Gesserit, they're looking more at things from the point of view of a materialist reduction in the sense of what's just breeding pairs and it's traits and features that they're engineering. Where the Bene Gesserit, they're thinking more of its bloodlines, right? So you can see that there's a through line there. And I think what's interesting is if you look at it from an idea of let's say depth psychology, right? A lot of the fundamentals of the depth psychology concept is the recognition of both the Darwinian and the Freudian, right? So I think what I'm getting to in this is the Darwinian side is we are the children of our parents. We are humans. We have biological parents. They had biological parents. And this goes back through all of history. And the traits that we take on very much have to do with the biological pairings of those parents. And there is a physical strata, physical description of this that, let's say, a Darwinian type of abstraction is suited to. You know, it's just like breeding peas or tulips. You can blend colors, you can blend features, you can blend characteristics. So there's something within us genetically that binds us to our phenotype, our bodies, something like this. At the same time, there's this Freudian sort of thing, which is sort of like it's like sort of a nature-nurture thing. The Freudian type would be more like, what was the conditions of this upbringing? What's the conditions of the family? What was the condition of the world at the time of this person? And the sort of epigenetic factors. And so then you put these two together, and you have you really have the root of what a lot of, let's say, anxiety therapy would be about. It's like, who are you in the body and who are you in the psychological sort of realm? And I think that this kind of is a parallel, it's a metaphor across these books. It's digging deep into what does it really mean to be human. And I think the two lenses philosophically, maybe three lenses that we explore in Alchemy and Anthroposophy in the Dune Saga is the Jungian alchemical one. So we can frame, for example, the Tleilaxo and the Bene Gesserit practices as a bit like alchemical processes, you know, solutio and coagulation and things like this, aligning the genetic programs with transformative archetypal structures. So if we interpret it this way, it's adding both a psychological and a spiritual dimension to the actions. This is why the Bene Gesserit seem like a priesthood or like a monastic order or nuns. They seem this kind of like a sisterhood, but it also kind of has a pseudo-religiosity to it. Even though they use religion as a manipulative thing, they still have a kind of reverence to them, you know? Then there's also Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy. So the Bene Gesserit's focusing on integrating, let's say, the different aspects of humanity. Their adoption of other memories has a kind of a reincarnation thing. And it sort of links on the idea of etheric, astral, egoic aspects of humanity. And there's also kind of, you know, a lot of what Steiner focuses on is this philosophical vision of spiritual evolution. How is humanity spiritually evolving? Right, so you see that the God Emperor being, the reason why I call it the ethics of Frank Herbert is because I feel like his ethics were humans are at their best when they're striving and overcoming, right? And he's going to give them the ultimate shit test, basically. The God Emperor is like the galactic shit test of humanity, because otherwise, left to themselves, people fight over, look at our politics today. It's horrible. Right? It's all like kind of lowest common denominator stuff. Finally, I want to tap into something else that kind of comes out in these. And I think it's the overarching thing. Like, think of it, the idea is, why Duncan Idaho, right? He starts out as the friend, the loyal friend. Then he becomes sort of symbolic of the Atreides virtue. Then he becomes symbolic of humanity's best features. And I think that this sort of trend crosses, in the books, 5,000 years of history, all kinds of strange machinations happen. But in the end, Duncan remains sort of like this archetype. I want to attach that to the concept of Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic field concept. So this resonance between Sheldrake's morphogenic fields and ancestral memories of the Bene Gesserit, there's sort of a compelling metaphor here. So the idea is, when we get to, and things that we've postulated in the fanfic Dune Revenant is like, in the far future, even beyond these books, there would be fish speaker schools. There'd be different bloodlines and different school lines that would adopt the specialties, like the Mentats one did, and the Bene Gesserit once did, and the Bene Gesserit did, and even the Guild Navigators. What if there were all new forms that these human-oriented groups could breed toward, specializing in artistic even, or other kinds of forms of position. So these fish speaker schools would be the inheritors of these morphogenic fields, and the crossroads of genetic and cultural development shaped by like invisible threads of patterns and future exploration, something like this. So we're going to have these as a sort of the broader sense of how we could frame what is the inner workings, what is the speculative inner workings of the Bene Gesserit and the Bene Gesserit in these books. And I think a lot of this is evidenced right in the books. The idea that the Bene Gesserit are working on the Duncan project. Now the Bene Gesserit are adapting the Duncan project. There's sort of like the idea of ghola recall studies. Like, imagine if we had ghola recall studies, or the idea of how can we recall different lines of ancestry. Look, we've got 5,000 years, and they've really only done this mostly with Duncan Idaho. And it was only due to the investment of the God Emperor. But then we can have like an ethical impact analysis. For example, a dual lineage. So the idea that we purport in Dune Revenant is like, imagine we just took, the Shiana line and the Mirabella line and the Duncan Idaho line, and we breed a line of this for 1,000 years. What kind of results will come out of this sort of pairing? So it's like moving away from, let's say, nationalism or tribalism, and moving more toward a sort of a specialization or a way of expression that's a sort of a flowering of a genomic pairing. So this is sort of an ethical impact assessment of this. Of course, there's like broader implications of this, like the idea of prophecy itself and building a prophecy-resistant human. That could lead to some other examples, like I've heard people talking about one of the things with Prophecy of Dune, or Dune Prophecy, is they see that place that's terrifying to them. They talk about this in Dune, like there's a place that's terrifying to women of the Bene Gesserit. And they're looking to breed the Kwisatz Haderach to look at that. And I saw one of the commenters, I think Quinn did a live podcast on this, but it was talking about, it almost seemed like it was the God Emperor looking back through time. So now if we have a retro-causality kind of theme in the world building of this books, I think this is where you really start to see that, is the God Emperor backwards making the Bene Gesserit react to the Kwisatz Haderach to create the breeding program to produce him, so that he can then build a more resistant and more robust humanity that can go out and be in space and something like this. So this idea of a more robust humanity is part of his golden path, right? So I think that there's, I'd say that we talk about somewhat of a synthesis of these Jungian, Steinerian, and Sheldrakean ideas. So let's talk about maybe we can talk about the evolution of the Bene Gesserit across these timelines, right? So first of all, like we said, they originally start out as building the Kwisatz Haderach. Then once they create it, that sort of topples down because it happened to generation too early. They lose control of it. The tyrant comes in, and now they're sort of suppressed for 3,500 years. And now we see them coming out of that suppression. And I think that each era of the Bene Gesserit's history is sort of a distinct view of their evolution. So they're driven by external forces like the rise of the Atreides or the rise of the Tleilaxu technology. And then they internally innovate around this. And I think that this is really linked to what I'm calling this Tleilaxu originary Evo theory and this Bene Gesserit mythogeneticism. It's like ways that the schools are looking to further expand humanity. And this is why I think are fascinating by these. These books lay the template for this kind of thinking. And I think, okay, is it a space shoot 'em up? Well, there's a little space shoot 'em up in there, but mostly it's science fiction as speculative fiction and some very, very deep ideas and very wild ideas, right? So this idea of, let's call it post-tyrant adaptations, right? So think of them as thought experiments. Let's think of these books as thought experiments. What happens to humanity if we stack all of this stuff? This is what Frank Herbert was doing. And I just think that you have the idea of the Tleilaxu. What are the Tleilaxu doing? So they're doing a deep investigation into the untapped evolutionary potentials inside of humanity. And they're looking at, with their unparalleled, I'd say, like genetic and biological expertise, they're looking for seeds of latent potential in the human genome, and they're looking for advanced techniques to tease out these traits that were previously unimaginable. Like we have thinking mentats, right? We don't need AI, they've got mentats. So this sort of theory of the Tleilaxu acknowledges sort of the limitations of the traditional ghola, and it's looking to advance the ghola beyond that, given what they've learned from the God Emperor's use of Duncan Idaho to create this quasi-Kwisatz Haderach, right? It's a ghola that understands all of his iterations. Think of it in a simple way like the Cylon resurrection from the new Battlestar, right? The new Battlestar Galactica, the Cylons can die multiple times, but they retain all the experiences from each of those lives. Or it's even like an Anne Rice vampire thing, where the vampires live through many, many eras of humanity. So the Anne Rice vampire is not only superhuman in their vampiric power, but socially they're more advanced because they're able to understand the broken hegemonies of each of the fallen empires that they lived in and understand where humanity went wrong and sort of can bring that to bear in their ability to go forward, something like that. So it's sort of like for the Tleilaxu, this is like a framework of unlocking the next level of human potential. How do we transcend, but how do we also ground it in some kind of human experience, right? We also know in the books that the Bene Gesserit are quite religious, right? So they see this all as God's genetic code. So they have a kind of a fanatic religious aspect to it. The Bene Gesserit mythogeneticism, on the other hand, this is a school of thought, and again, I'm thought experimenting from these books. But the idea of this is this thought experiment, let's say, it's exploring the integration of genetics with myth and cultural archetypes. And it builds upon the Bene Gesserit's long-standing mastery of mythological engineering, let's say. They've got their missionaria protectiva, they've got their bloodlines that they're breeding, and they propose that lineage is not merely biological, but it's also a spiritual and a cultural program, and that genetics must correspond with the collective human myth and to achieve the ultimate potential. So we need less divisive things and more things that are moving forward. So I think the mythogeneticism concept across these two books also shows that the scattering, not only did it introduce genetic diversity with Honored Matres, but it also created new cultural narratives. And this reframes our whole missionaria protectiva. So it's not just a tool of control, which I think it always reduces to a tool of control. Whenever you have a control, you've got a tyrant. This is what he came out. It's like, you want to have houses that are feuding? I'll become the ultimate tyrant, and all your feuds will disappear because I'll have a chokehold on all the supplies and resources until you guys can become more robust and rise to the occasion. So it's get over your petty thing. It's like, when we were children, putting away childish things, that kind of concept. So, and this is sort of gets explored a bit in the Dune Revenant line and whatnot. But anyway, if you guys are interested in this, you can check out more of this kind of stuff in the Alchemy and Anthroposophy of the Dune Saga. There's another topic I want to bring up that comes out of here is the Samuel Butler concepts. So in we call the Great Revolt against the thinking machines the Butlerian Jihad. And I believe that, and we've got other podcasts on this as well, but I believe that Frank Herbert was influenced by the 19th century English writer Samuel Butler in the ideas of other memory, prescience, and thinking machines. So Samuel Butler not only wrote a thing about Erewhon, he wrote a book called Erewhon, a satirical utopian novel, and it has a chapter called The Book of the Machines, in which the machines come to life and they rebel against the human. But they're like farm machines and like all kinds of factory machines. So if left unchecked, the machinery might evolve and reproduce and eventually supplant the human race. But not only does he have the idea of thinking machines, but in another book, Life and Habit, I believe it's called, I find the origins of Frank Herbert's other memories. So again, it sounds like it's right out of ghola technology. Frank Herbert's Dune series, particularly Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune, presents a universe rich in complexity. Among the myriad influences on Herbert, Samuel Butler's evolutionary ideas stand out, especially when examining the characters of Duncan Idaho, Miles Tegg, Siona. Butler's musing on inherited memory, directed evolution, and the nature of consciousness resonates through these works. Throughout the Dune series, the ghola incarnations of Duncan Idaho serve as one of the most evident manifestations of Butler's idea of ancestral memories. But by the time of Heretics and Chapterhouse, Duncan Idaho's cumulative memory of humanity has dramatically expanded. No longer is he just a ghola with the memories of one life. He's the embodiment of multiple lifetimes, each iteration inheriting the memories of the last. Drawing from Butler's Life and Habit, which delves into the idea that organisms inherit not only physical attributes, but also memories and experiences, Duncan's multitudinous reincarnations give literal form to this theory. Every time he's reawakened, he grapples with the compounded weight of countless past lives, revealing both the potential and peril of such deep ancestral memory. So, for example, we also see Miles Tegg gets unlocked, where he has like almost superhuman strength in this. So what is Butler's theory? So, loosely stated, well, maybe we'll end on this one. Loosely stated, Samuel Butler has a theory of that memories are also transmitted in the genome. So the concept here, I think you've probably heard of the study where they'll do something with generations of rats, where they'll do something like shock the rats when they try to get the food, and the rats will avoid the plate to get the food, something like that shock plate, right? So then they'll take rats that are born from this and they'll breed them somewhere else where there's no electrical plate. And the children of those rats will still avoid the plate, even though there's never been a shock. So the idea here is, how are the rats that are born 3 generations later or 2 generations later with no evidence of the stimulation from the environment, how do they adopt? And they're raised without the parents. This is the other part. So those rats would be raised without the parents to teach them to avoid the plate. They still avoid the plate. So this was one of those ideas that Butler kind of purports on, an area to look into. Obviously, he's been, I guess, let's say in like a normie science or mainstream science, no one's going down this road, right? But this is something very interesting, at least from a writer's world, right? From the world of Herbert, I think he took this idea and just went crazy with it, because it does open us up to lots of interesting things. Now, of course, there's the ethics of all this. When I say that God Emperor of Dune is the ethics of Frank Herbert, I say it in the pure philosophical sense, the way Jacques Lacan says civilization and its discontents is the ethics of Freud, right? Because the ethics of, what does it mean? It means, philosophically speaking, his ethics means, how do we explore the crossroads, the anxiety at the crossroads of human civilization and progress. So as the civilization increases, the anxiety of the individual increases. And this becomes an ethical question. It becomes a theater of ethical investigation. That's what we mean by an ethics. So it doesn't mean a Ten Commandments. It means an ethical study. His ethics, right? Sort of like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, right? It's a treatise on ethics. And if we say that, if we take Lacan's point that civilization and its discontents is Freud's ethics, it means it is in this book that Freud explores what it means to be civilized and its impact on us in the forms of anxiety, something like this. And what does progress then mean, right? So what I say is, and there's a podcast, you guys can go check below on the podcast of this, and we talk about the ethics of it here. Actually, I've got a chapter in Alchemy and Anthroposophy of the Dune Saga also where we explore the ethics of Frank Herbert's Ethics of God Emperor Dune, Freud Discontents, Lacanian Psychoanalysis of Leto II. So if you're interested in this, but just to get to the point out, God Emperor of Dune is the ethics in the sense that it says what is best for humanity, and we kind of, Frank Herbert engineers this situation, much like a Brothers Karamazov situation, in which the father has different children who have different, one's religious, one's political, something like this, right? God Emperor of Dune also has this kind of thing, is how do these schools transform to build a more robust and resilient humanity? It's not to say that we need a tyrant to do that. It's Frank Herbert explores it through the metaphor of a tyrant. So anyway, I think that's probably going to be a good place to wrap it up. I mean, if you want to dig more deeply into the Samuel Butler stuff, we got some of that in the book. In the end, we'll see where the future takes us. Hopefully this has been interesting. Hopefully I've transmitted at least why I think these books are so amazing, why they're super interesting. If any of those things sounded interesting, it probably would be worth it for you guys to read them. They are quite readable. They read fast. You just have to keep track of things. If you look at this last trilogy as a sort of an aging Frank Herbert trying to say what are the logical conclusions of humanity 10,000 years from now, you get these Atlantean themes that come up. You get these very wide existential tensions that come out of the reaction to Leto's millennia-long reign, and sort of like the insights that we have. And I call out Jungian and Steiner's, but you also see there's Freudian aspects in here. There's Lacanian concepts in here that we explore in the book. Leto, in the end of God Emperor, Leto fragments, his consciousness fragments, and all of the worms hold like a gem of his consciousness. So you think of this as sort of the way that the knowledge gets transmitted, and then you see that, something like Shiana's ability to resist prescience. It's like you can't see her in the future, like breeding the humanity that cannot be detected. And maybe there was even a route for that to go back to an AI story. I think that's I think that's what Herbert and Anderson did in their seventh Dune. In our seventh Dune, we took it a bit more into the futures, that this keeps on going. Like this just keeps on going. If I can quote the last chapter of this little aphorism in Dune Revenant. It's sort of after the scattering, where does humanity go, right? After the scattering, they come home from the scattering. And I wrote this thing. So for the message now is known to all who follow Shiana's new paths. It says, one day even the fish speaker schools will evolve. They will turn into different directions, and the members of these schools will twist to keep up. Just as the great houses gave way to the age of the God Emperor, as the scattering gave way to the returning and the integration, so will new ages follow. The unconcealing, called the dawning, by a million will follow. Born out of these times, the emerging will follow. And then the most living of ages, called the waking, will run its course until the quiet reflection characterized by the next age, called the sleeping. We send this greeting to you from the last age, our age, that we call the dreaming. We are far different from you in some ways. We are still the same. This is our hello. You may think of us as different from you as your human ancestors. We remind you of the gifts you already have, hope, faith, and imagination. Now we bid you farewell, for you will not hear from us again. So this is the dreaming. Guys, check out the book in the bookstore. We've also got several projects on the way. We've got our, speaking of the dreaming, we've got our alchemical courtship in the dreamlands. It takes place in the Lovecraft's dreamlands. You can check out our bookstore link down below. We've also got a Patreon if you'd like to help us out. I'm trying to get back into the swing of the podcast. I think I'm down to once a month now, but hopefully you guys are still out there. Appreciate all your comments, likes, subscribes below, and we'll talk to you soon. Let me know next topics. I've been reading Peter Slaughterjack's Spherology trilogy. I'm on Bubbles right now, so maybe we'll dig that out next time. I've also been about to jump into the original Journey to the West, given all the fun about Black Myth Wukong. So a couple other topics coming up. Let me know what you guys would like to talk about. We can chat down below, talk over in the Patreon if you want to keep abreast of the new saga. We're exploring the first volume, Aim Aimless, Aim Vicious, of the alchemical courtship novels in the Dreamlands. It takes place in Cellophase of Lovecraft's Dreamlands. We also go to Daleth Leen. I've done a little talk about it in the last podcast. You could go check those out. Okay, guys. Thanks, everyone. Take care out there. Be good. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.